What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Walkout Network. It's your man, Ant Walker, here with another edition of Unleash, the supposed to be weekly panel discussion show. I say that because, yes, we did miss last week due to my terrible idea of communication. I was out sick, tried to get the message to the fellas that they were going to run without me, and that message did not send because I had a crappy phone. I have since replaced my phone, and here we are. Let's go ahead and introduce the two gentlemen who join me as always. First is the senior editor of Sherlock.com. You know him as the jack of all trades who's mastered them all, Mr. Ben Duffy. Ben, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I missed you, and happy belated first Father's Day.
Thank you very much for that. Of course, the guy who made me a father is in the background teething, so rough times in the Walker household. Happy Father's Day to you as well, Ben. And of course, we've got the man with all the numbers, all the stats, all the figures. He is the associate editor of Sherdog.com. He is one Mr. Jay Petrie. Jay, how are you doing today, brother?
Yeah, I missed you guys too last week. I'm glad that we're all copacetic now, and hope you guys enjoyed your Father's Day weekends. I enjoyed my own weekend for a different reason, and it wasn't all related to the fights, but it kind of was because of something that happened this weekend. So the stat of the week is 4. For the 4th weekend in a row, the UFC posted up in the UFC Apex in Vegas, like their headquarters. This is the first time the UFC has ever held 4 consecutive shows in the same venue. They always have jumped around, Pearl de Palms to Mandalay Bay to this and that and this and that. But this is the first time the UFC has ever had 4 shows in the same building, back to back to back to back.
Oh, wow, it's an interesting stat there. Of course, not something that they intended on.
Nope.
But, man, that Apex Center got up and running right on time in hindsight. So let's go ahead and discuss all the things that have been happening in the Apex Center. So we'll just very quickly gloss over this because it was last week when we didn't go on air. But Jessica I and Cynthia Calvillo had their main event. Calvillo was the victor via unanimous decision. So swing or miss, fellas. Will Calvillo's victory throw her into a flyweight title shot against one Valentina Shevchenko? Ben, I will begin with you.
I am going to hold out hope that they do the decent and sensible thing and give it to Lauren Murphy first, who at least has won several consecutive fights in the flyweight division. So that is me swinging with hope.
Someone who has not learned from the UFC's past deeds. Jay, swing or miss, Cynthia Calvillo is the next flyweight title.
Duffy, dog, how many times do you have to touch the fire before you realize it burns, man? There's no way the UFC is going to do good for Lauren Murphy. I mean, they made a storyline in The Ultimate Fighter about people not knowing her name. So there's no possible way Lauren Murphy is going to get her just desserts. But they have a really weird, it's not a logjam. The UFC doesn't exactly know who to put up against Valentina Shevchenko, because what is the point in putting a fight together where the champion's going to be minus 1,000 every fight? That's eventually people start to get disappointed when there's no hope. They're abandoning all hope. You enter here. So I was kind of expecting the Modafferi-Murphy fight would show us some sort of clarity for what's going to happen next at flyweight, because as we know, Shevchenko is down for injury. Her timetable could be 4 months, could be 6 months. We don't really know, which is actually a little surprising. But she was supposed to fight Joanne Calderwood. Now, assuming they keep that intact, they could want Cynthia Calvillo to be there as a backup plan in case that fight falls through. I could see that, so I will swing that Calvillo will get the opportunity over a Murphy, but the UFC has to kind of be holding its nose, going, "Oh boy, let's make that fight, guys. That's the money fight."
Yeah, you know what, Jay, I definitely have to join you on one point you made there, where it's kind of like, what's the point of putting together certain fights where there's, no matter who you put there, they're going to be a gross underdog, whether it's Lauren Murphy or whether it's Cynthia Calvillo or JoJo Calderwood. Nobody is really expecting anyone to dethrone Shevchenko, so it almost doesn't really matter who you put in. But if we can look at card placement in recent times, I think that should tell the story. I mean, Roxanne Modafferi and Lauren Murphy were the second fight
buried.
Buried, and this is after Roxanne Modafferi put together a career-defining performance, upsetting Macy Barber, and this was on a high-profile event. So for her to roll off of that upset win to be the second fight on the prelims doesn't really say that the winner is going to get any sort of preferred placement. And then Jessica Eye and Cynthia Calvillo being a main event, even though it wasn't exactly the most revered main event in recent memory. So I think those will probably be the best indicators. Murphy or Calvillo probably isn't going to be favored to do very well against Shevchenko.
I mean, maybe they could. The other alternative is if Shevchenko is out until December. Again, if there's something that people know that we don't know, okay, that's great. But she could be out to the end of the year, Shevchenko. So that's the perfect opportunity to do the Calderwood thing. JoJo's going to sit in the shelf, like she said she kind of wants to keep the fight. Do Murphy versus Calvillo, and then at least you have a little more clarity. I mean, put that for like a mid-September ESPN Plus card, and there you go.
Yeah, I mean, whatever. They'll do something. They'll do something. But so let's go ahead and move along to the most recent main event. That was Curtis Blaydes defeating Alexander Volkov by unanimous decision. Now, Blaydes had a very dominant win there, out-wrestled Volkov pretty much from bell to bell, even though he did, looks like he gassed kind of halfway through that fight pretty badly, but he was able to still get that win. Now, afterward, Dana White, the consummate promoter,
what a match,
decided to trash Blaydes' performance. Now, does this mean anything that Dana was trashing his performance? Do you think it's going to affect his hopes for a title shot, gentlemen?
It might, but if cooler heads prevail, the real problem is that Blaydes has lost twice in vicious fashion to Francis Ngannou. And the unfortunate thing about it is the way he's lost actually makes me willing to see a third time. I'm like, I want to, I haven't learned my lesson yet, but the only way we're going to get that happening is if Blaydes gets the title first and Ngannou has to come get it from him. If Ngannou wins the title, Blaydes will literally have to beat everybody else in the top 15 to get a shot again. If the UFC recognizes that and recognizes that they're going to have a problem if Ngannou becomes the champ and Blaydes is just sitting there like the ultimate goalie, just like smacking everything away. Like, hopefully this doesn't affect it too badly. I mean, if he had just steamrolled Volkov in a round and a half, like I expected he would, I think Blaydes would be a shoo-in for the winner of Miocic and Cormier, assuming Cormier doesn't win and retire. But anyway, hopefully it doesn't. You got me all being hopeful and naive here.
Okay, now I'm gonna have to have the rain cloud coming down on me now. The position that Curtis Blaydes is in is a very precarious one, but it is a familiar one. It is not the first fighter that has been the ultimate gatekeeper, so to speak. Joe Benavidez played that for the flyweight division, could beat basically everybody besides the champion. And he had to just keep on knocking off contenders, and the UFC go, oh, and they'd tear up their slips and they'd throw them on the track. And they were always very disappointed, almost seeming when Joe Benavidez won. But the pecking order for heavyweight is almost comical because, when Sherdog does our rankings panel, we discuss with 15, 20 different staff members, and sometimes we'll have disagreement about exactly who's who. Heavyweight is a very clear 1, 2, 3, 4. Distinctly clear because there are ways to keep track exactly how do we think so-and-so does, has done, will do. Stipe recently beat Cormier. That's number 2. And then Stipe also beat Ngannou. And then off of the map right here is Blaydes because he got smashed twice by Ngannou. So I don't want to see a third fight for a while because I don't think there's anything that has come from it. We discussed this actually in a recent show. Hasn't gone to look different, and he hasn't because he's gotten faster knockouts. But do we really think he's shored up his takedown defense to do it, or is he just the same gigantic guy that will eventually get dropped or dragged down like Stipe eventually did? We don't know, and we won't know until those fights happen. But Blades is in the worst situation right now because who do you put him up against? We don't want to see him fight Overeem again. We don't want to see him fight Dos Santos again. The names in the division, there are so few people to fight. You got Derek Lewis is fighting Alexei Oleinik, and you have Dos Santos is fighting Rosenstrike. So in terms of fresh matchups, the next, 6 months, we have Walt Harris and Augusto Sakai. So let's burn down the store to get those fights going on. I think, honestly, he needs to hope that Gustafsson beats Verdun, because then he can have a fresh fight and it be a match for Gustafsson to really see if he's there. Because otherwise, every fight is I wonder what's going to happen here, guys.
And, I mean, let me just throw out, we may be getting a little bit of a rock, paper, scissors situation, too. Am I the only guy here that thinks Blades would beat Miocic if they fought in 2 months?
I would initially I'd favor Stipe, but Blades winning that fight wouldn't surprise me. I think it's an interesting enough matchup to put together and to just see what's going to happen. I certainly wouldn't count Blades out in that matchup at all.
Yeah, I think the first round would tell us everything. Within 2 minutes of the fight, we'd know who's going to win the fight. And so it's an interesting style matchup because Stipe didn't get to fight Kane, the wrestler. And for some reason, Daniel Cormier has decided to throw out the takedown with the bathwater when he fights him. So we don't, really know. I mean, Cormier, if he's smart, he will try and take him down. And then we could know how Blades would do against Stipe.
Yeah, like you think about that rematch between Cormier and Stipe. That first round, Cormier absolutely ran through Stipe, and he did it with wrestling.
Yeah,
he just abandoned that afterward, and
just got punched in the belly.
Yeah, to get into a very badly played boxing match afterwards. So, it definitely begs a lot of questions, and I'm going to echo the sentiments of, I believe it was James Lynch, who's with the Score right now, good friend of ours, been on this show before. Lynch was saying that, he was surprised that they put together the Derek Lewis and Alexei Oleinik fight, considering that Blades and Volkov were about to fight, and how, if Blades won that one, Derek Lewis would have made a perfect opponent. Yeah. So now we're in that scenario where that would be the best fight for Curtis Blades. But of course, Lewis is off the table right now. So interesting to see if he comes out victorious against Alexei Oleinik. And even if Oleinik wins that, I'm still not sure if I want to see Blades versus Oleinik. Like, that's just,
I don't want to see that again. He kicked him in the ear, remember? Wasn't that the fight? Yeah.
So it just, I don't think I want to see that again. It's not really anything that's going to tell us anything. So, I mean, do you guys, but I do want to, well, Jay, actually, go ahead and say what you got to say.
I wanted to ask you guys something, kind of an audible here. So we had a main event in I versus Calvillo that everybody dumped on. And we had everybody being the MMA community. And we had a main event in Blades versus Volkov that people go, oh, man, that's a really interesting style matchup. Can the really tough wrestler get down the long-rangey boxer with good takedown defense? Well, of those two fights, which was the most visually appealing? Which was the most interesting? Which was the more interesting fight of those two that we had, the two main events?
I would say that
pretty, they were pretty similar. They played into a similar narrative where there was some interest in the later rounds, even though someone was clearly ahead because the person who was behind was, starting to build some momentum.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this: the Calvillo fight at least had some element of, it's better than I thought it was, as opposed to the expectation set with Blade and Volkov. I was firmly in the camp that this would not make it out of the first round. I thought Blades would take down Volkov and smash his head into oblivion, especially considering that they were in such a small cage. And those two guys are not small gentlemen at all. I'll tell you, that's been in the room with Volkov a couple of times, and yeah, he can take up an entire room. So to imagine him in a smaller space, no, just didn't seem like this would be anything that would make it past the first 5 minutes. So.
Well, if he stood right here and put his right hand on the wall, his left hand would reach the center of the octagon. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that it was a tough matchup there.
Yeah, I'm gonna also I'm reminded of something that TJ DeSantis said on the latest version of the roundtable. So I guessed it on that one last week, and TJ mentioned how Dean Thomas was saying before Tyron Woodley's fight at the Apex Center, they tested out just what that smaller cage felt like. They both went to the opposite ends of the cage and walked normally to see how long it would take to meet in the middle. 2 steps.
And that's for them who are both like 5'9", 5'10" dudes.
Right. Like Dean Thomas is not that much bigger than me. Tyron Woodley and I are about the same height. He's just, more muscle than me, but that's about like 2 steps.
Even that, it's pretty close.
Yeah, well, slightly. He's got the slight edge.
He just got out of camp. That's all.
Yeah, I've just been on the couch. That's all. That's the only difference here. All right, fellas. So let's go ahead and move things along. Probably the most, I think the most interesting part about the event Saturday was the newcomer Max Roskopf.
Roskopf.
Yeah. Max Roskopf took this fight on short notice against Austin Hubbard. He quit on the stool after the second round. Of course, he didn't just smoothly quit on the stool. This was quite a sickening process to watch unfold, as he literally argued with his coach Robert Drysdale about his ability to continue, and Drysdale refused to call a fight. It was actually Max himself who called it off, as the official came over to him when it was time to answer the bell for the third round. So, fellas, we keep having this conversation, again, and I'm so sick of having it, but it's so necessary that we keep talking about it until the culture changes. What should be done about this aversion to the corner throwing in the towel for a fighter?
This was a real problem for me in a different way than some of the fights we've seen before. There's a lot of people made the connection to Anthony Smith versus Glover Teixeira, where he was rough. At the end of the fourth round, people are going, "Oh boy, I think we're good here," and everybody knew we can probably pack this up. When I was on the Sherlock play-by-play, I think I even wrote at the very end of the round, if the corner or the doctors called the fight between rounds, we'd probably be okay. But the coach, Robert Drysdale, former UFC fighter for a very brief stint, he claimed, because he was asked later about, hey man, what was the deal here? There's a line between being encouraging and rallying your fighter and getting them to come back from the brink of defeat, and there's all that honor to this. But when a fighter says, "I'm done," more times than they land significant strikes the round before, that's about as clear as it gets. By the way, he landed 6 strikes that round. He said, "I'm done" 9 times. Okay, the kid deserves a ton of props for taking this fight, just period. Like, end of sentence, for taking this fight. A couple days notice, and he was a 5-0 kid, 5 submissions, never gone past I think it was like halfway through the second round or so. He had that newcomer surge. I got to get through the round. I got to have a gas tank about a round and change, and I'm going to win the fight like Justin James did that night. I'm going to go crazy and do it, and maybe he could have dragged Hubbard down, take his neck. And what we saw was the worst result at the end of that adrenaline dump, because Max Roskopf was in a he was visibly as defeated as it gets. And Robert Drysdale and the corner of Roskopf, the corner's duty is to protect their fighter. And this corner is a former fighter who has historically made some horrible decisions in the sport. This is a guy who was flagged more times in the UFC for I think it was his TE ratio for elevated testosterone than he had actual fights. So failed more drug tests than fights. So maybe he's not the sharpest tool in the shed to be the voice of reason, say, okay, let's fight another day. There's no room for this. You know what I mean? Like when the Nevada State Athletic Commission said, we're going to investigate this, I went, good. That has to happen. We have to know, and we have to make sure this doesn't happen. Because what about fighters that can't say the words "I'm done"? Like Max was lucky to be able to verbalize it to the inspector, and because that was the whole situation, was that the Nevada Athletic Commission inspector was watching the whole thing go on as Max was talking to Drysdale and said, "Oh, I'm done. No, you're not. You're not. You're a champ kid. You can make it." And the inspector told, I think it was Mark Smith, he said, "Hey man, you probably should check this out." And he asked and said, "Hey, you going to make it?" And Max said, "No." God, I don't know. It hurt to watch. And I'm not a pro fighter. I've competed in amateur competitions before, but I've trained for many years in martial arts. So knowing that I have someone in my corner to watch my back to make sure I don't do something stupid is a fundamental thing that you should just feel as a martial artist, to have somebody there that can think and take decisions on your behalf. Well, Max didn't have that person. He had the opposite, and that was hard to see, guys.
Definitely was a tough one to watch there. I was probably most reminded of the Amanda Nunes title defense against Raquel Pennington.
Yeah.
All right. Because like we drew the parallels between Anthony Smith and Glover Teixeira simply because that was so recent. Like
right.
it's so fresh in our memories.
Right.
But we were looking at the corner for the nonverbal cues. In that for Smith saying, "Hey, my teeth are falling out," to say, "Okay, this is a good time to call it," and for Smith looking dejected, looking defeated, and appearing to be a broken man at that point. So that's what we were pointing at the corner for. Now in the Raquel Pennington fight, she said very clearly, "I can't continue," and she was still pushed out there. And the defense for that was, okay, this is a title fight. This is the biggest opportunity she'll have, and just see it through to the end. I disagree, but okay. Like if we're gonna play that game, but we're talking about the curtain jerker of a prelim of a fight night. We're talking pretty low on the totem pole compared to a main event, much less a pay-per-view main event for a title. Now, of course, I understand for Roscoff, this is a huge opportunity, but hey, you're taking a fight on short notice. The UFC typically will give you another opportunity with the benefit of a full camp. So maybe Drysdale wasn't thinking that one quite through on that regard. Ben, what are your thoughts on this non-stoppage?
Well, I have two. There seem to be two narratives that came out of it in the immediate aftermath, and I have something to say about both. The first one, obviously, is the wave of criticism that has been directed at Robert Drysdale. And in general, I'm on board with it. Guy says he's done. He's done. What are you doing? This is a horrible look. The only thing I will offer up, not even really in Drysdale's defense, but just as kind of something to think about, is that anytime any of us is watching a corner interaction between a fighter and their coach, we are eavesdropping on 1 minute of a relationship that has taken up hundreds or even thousands of hours. We are eavesdropping on 60 seconds of a conversation as a near stranger between two people who know each other intimately. And they use different forms of language to communicate. Think of coaches that you think of as really good cornermen. There are some that are the yelling and screaming rah, rah, rah type. There are some that will flat out lie to their fighters and tell them they're winning a fight that they're losing, or vice versa. There are some that are more chameleonic. I mean, Greg Jackson is very famous for kind of really having a different style for every fighter. We don't know what the relationship between Roscoff and Drysdale is like, other than that Drysdale's been his coach forever. Like, these are two guys that know each other very well. I mean, for all we know, they had a pattern where when it was going badly for Roscoff, in other situations, he'd be like, I'm done. And Drysdale will be like, no, you're not. I don't think that's the case, but I'm just saying that, there can be more subtext to that communication that we're not really aware of. That's all I'm really offering up there. Like I said, should have been stopped. The weirdest thing to me was that Mark Smith wouldn't even make the call himself. It's like, on the advice of the physician, I'm like, what kind of physician do you need to be? This is not a fucking prison yard. If the guy says he doesn't want to fight anymore, the fight's over. Like, what kind of medical school did you have to go to like be able to like feel comfortable enough in your own authority to say that?
On the advice of someone who understands English that happens to be
exactly
in and around the octagon.
I mean, well, the doctor heard him say, "I quit," so therefore the doctor stopped it.
The difference between Roscoff and Smith or Pennington is that Smith and Pennington looked beat to shit. Roscoff looked tired and discouraged. And while it's true that when you step up for the UFC on short notice, you typically do, get a little bit of favor, and you typically do get at least one more fight. What Roscoff did is almost the only thing you could do in a short notice fight to make a poor impression on the UFC.
I think one thing we can't ignore. I mean, when you're saying that Smith and Pennington look completely beat by the time, and Roscoff wasn't necessarily beaten by that time. I mean, he took an enormous amount of body shots, and you're talking about a short notice fight. I think he had 10 days notice for this fight. Yep. So he had an abbreviated camp. Probably training conditions aren't ideal due to the current pandemic, and to get in there and to take repeated body shots, and probably blowing your load in the first round, hoping for a quick finish. He was beaten. It just wasn't on his face.
Right.
God knows what his rib cage went through, because he, that second round, he took so many hard body shots right there. It hurt watching. I'll say that.
That's actually the other thing I was going to jump over to, because the other kind of response I've seen, and they're not mutually exclusive. I've seen people who had something to say to Drysdale and to Roscoff is, what a wimp, what a quitter, what a coward, like who just quits on the stool, go out on your shield, this and that. I mean, Roscoff is 25. He was 5-0, now 5-1. As Jay pointed out, his last 4 fights had been first round rear naked chokes. The one before that was early in the second round. It is entirely possible that Saturday was the first time he had lost a minute of anything.
Probably.
I mean, he is a physical specimen. He's the kind of guy, he's training under Robert Drysdale. You have the sneaking idea that he has completely dominated everyone he's fought so far. And it would be a shame if him, just quitting on the stool and retiring actually affected his future in the sport in any long-lasting way, because it's only because of the weird era that we're in right now that this even happened in the UFC. This kind of guy, under normal circumstances, would have at least 2 or 3 more fights on the local scene before getting a call from the Contender Series. If you look back, I mean, there are some well-known fighters who were contenders in the UFC. If you look far enough back on Caro Parisian's record on the regionals, you're like, what the hell is TKO exhaustion? That sounds a lot to me like a dude who quit.
Yep.
But because it happened on a local show, I think in California, I mean, never mind that the opponent was Sean Shirk, and we should have been able to draw some conclusions from that fight. It never really cursed him. I mean, he turned out to be a bit of a head case, but we had to learn on our own once he actually got to the UFC. It's really none of Roscoff's fault that this happened under the relatively bright lights of the UFC Apex. And I don't know whether he's just going to dust himself off and be like, okay, I guess that's what it feels like to be tired and lose. Let's go back and get it. Or he will turn out not to be professional fighter material, but it would be a shame if this was something that dogged him just because of how and when and where it happened.
And I think that was what I think Dana actually, because Dana does make some good professional choices that we like to rip on Dana White a lot, but the way he didn't criticize Roscoff after by quitting on the stool, he's Dana basically said, well, why should we hold that against him? What's the big deal? Kind of thing like that. If this had happened on the Contender Series, you know, he would have lost. He would have gone back to the regionals, no big deal. But this happened on a big stage. This happened on ESPN. So this, unfortunately, I am concerned, Duffy, that is the kind of demoralizing loss that changes him forever as a fighter. And that sucks. That shouldn't be the case. Right. This isn't boxing where one loss changes the trajectory of your career very often, unless you're a John Jones type. And even then, he lost to, I mean, Matt Hamill dominated him, obviously, but he had the loss on his record and he moved on. But Roscoff, going from undefeated young Thundercat to got beat so badly by a guy named Thud that he's drummed out of this. Well, no, that's his nickname. That he's drummed out of it. I feel for the kid. That I think you're right. I think you're right, Duffy, in that this is the only thing that he could have done to not get a return appearance. Which, man, if the corner had stopped it, no big deal. When Duke Rufus stopped the fight for Anthony Pettis, people didn't go, "Oh, you lazy little what?" No, they said, "Oh man, his hand is snapped here, and here." Okay, that's good. He didn't fight the rest of Tony Ferguson. Yeah. But yeah, Roscoff, this is a raw deal. No, that should be his nickname, raw deal.
If
Roscoff.
Anything, the real disservice that Drysdale did it was making like a huge production travesty out of it.
Yes.
If Drysdale had just gone, no, we're done. We're done.
Yeah.
And then to carry out the narrative later to say, no, I defy you to say that I was wrong, and call people and say, no, I made the right call from it. This is recent things. When Drysdale said, I believe he talked to Marcelo Alonso of Sherdog and basically said, I made the right call. Everybody was like, come on. There's only one thing you could say that would not go over well and hurt your fighter, and it's you saying that. And so this did, this.
Yeah, I mean, so gentlemen, do you think Roscoff deserves another shot?
Absolutely,
100%,
absolutely. And honestly, if not, he just deserves not to be blackballed. Because if he goes right back, to the regionals, he's going to choke out 3 or 4 more dudes, and he'll be back.
Yeah, that's
all he needs is for it not to be a permanent bar to re-entry in the UFC.
Well, then here's an olive branch. Why don't they put him on the Contender Series? Because that's going to happen now. Throw him on the August card. Throw him on the September card. And then you can at least have him, okay, it's a second chance to make your first impression kind of thing, on a fight camp, not dying, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that was my thought too. At the very least, if you insist on booting him out, okay, pick up one regional win and get a call from the Contender Series. And even for his confidence, if he is going to be adversely mentally affected by what happened Saturday night, let him get a regional win over somebody just to get the confidence booster going, and then get that call from the Contender Series. But either way, he deserves some other shot as far as the promotion is concerned. So, all right, fellas. So let's move on now to the best title segment in all of media history, and that is "I'm Not Surprised, Mr. Falcons." This is where we get to share something that surprised us in the world of combat sports via the ESPN card that we just witnessed, anything related to that or anything outside of that. So, Ben, I'll start with you. What is your "I'm Not Surprised, Mr. Falcons" moment this week?
Hey, I had a pretty good weekend this past weekend at the old Pick'em. I went 5 for 6. The one I got wrong was Jim Miller versus Roosevelt Roberts. It hurts my heart and soul every time I pick against Jim Miller. It wounds me to my core. He is one of the fighters who's been around almost as long as I've been a fan of the sport, and just one of the ultimate good dudes. One of the guys who just as going to go down as one of the very best, never to win a UFC title unless something really outlandish happens, and just always been a good dude. Never done anything to embarrass himself or the sport, but he's been such a crapshoot the last couple of years. I mean, his performance has really dropped off. He strung together 4 losses in a row at one point. Being Jim Miller, his job was as secure as one can be with 4 straight losses. But it turned out he had Lyme disease.
The whole time. So just
a very tricky, very sticky, hard to diagnose disease that just happens to make you tired and miserable all the time. He took some steps to address that, and all of a sudden in his mid-30s, he had a bit of a resurgence, but still turned out incredibly inconsistent from fight to fight. And I figured he was going to be pickings for Roosevelt Roberts. You know, Roberts is one of those guys. You have to string together a lot of wins to kind of move out of the piranha tank at 155. You know, there's a bunch of dudes down there, and you really need to win 4 or 5 in a row before they even start talking about matching you up with a borderline top 15-ish talent. But I thought he was one of the guys that was going to rise out of that tank. I still do. But I was reminded of what prime Jim Miller looks like. You know, because even before he locked up the armbar, I literally had the thought that, oh man, the 2009 Jim Miller would finish this dude right now, and this shit would be over, you know, by, you know, good to know you. And then he did it. It was fantastic. Jim Miller turns 37 in a couple of months.
37.
But he's still a problem. He's still such a dangerous fighter, depending on what sort of physical state he's in. I don't feel comfortable picking his fights anymore because he's so inconsistent and looks great or not great in a vacuum, regardless of who he's taking on. I mean, yeah, the Bronx like wiped him out, but a lot of guys in the UFC, I think, would have wiped Miller out that night. He just didn't look great. Clay Guida speared himself straight into a guillotine, so I have no idea how Miller was that night. You know what I mean? Yeah. But I am very surprised that Jim Miller is still out here beating legit up-and-coming prospects and is still a restaurant-quality lightweight on any given night if he's feeling good. So I am pleasantly surprised.
All right. And Jay, what is your I'm not surprised Mr. Falcons moment this week?
Well, my backup stat of the week was something about Jim Miller, because the fact that he had his 10th UFC submission, and only 3 other fighters have ever done that, and that they were, you know, Gracie, Oliveira, Maia. Okay, that's a pretty amazing group of names to be part of. And, oh yeah, his last 4 wins, all by submission within 3 minutes.
USA.
I mean, just Jim,
just an American, like, somewhere in the, on the leaderboard.
Hey, Jim Miller, man. But my I'm not surprised moment came, I think it was before the Guida Green fight, but I can't remember exactly where it really came up. So House. The Cutman Don House, y'all know him. Mm-hmm. He's the Cutman that, by the way, famously was actually friends with Dana White. I believe in the big Stitch, Never My Friend thing. I think that Dana actually said, House is my friend, we hang out, that kind of thing.
Actually interviewed about that before, yeah.
Well, okay, so House, to those who haven't seen, was wearing multiple logos representing the QAnon conspiracy theory group, cabal, whatever you want to call those knuckleheads. So those unfamiliar, QAnon is a conspiracy theory driving group of, well, I'm going to get hacked anyway, some morons that believe that politicians, celebrities are part of this massive international child sex trafficking ring, and the president's involved, and it goes all the way down, and it's a major ultra conspiracy, all these terrible things. Of course, there's never a shred of proof. All of their claims are massively disproven, and not just by those involved, so there's some sort of confirmation bias. So just the worst kind of peddlers of nonsense. So there's House putting credence to these group of knuckleheads with multiple logos of their team, very clear on his attire. And this is an issue because the UFC famously cracks down on cutmen. Cutmen, under most sports, cutmen can have their own sponsors. It's a very famous thing. Stitch was upset about that. So the cutmen aren't allowed to have anything on their attire besides like a flag and maybe like in memory of kind of thing. So this was cleared by somebody. And this went through whatever channels it needed to go through to be printed or embroidered on his official Cutman apparel, to go through whatever checks that the UFC and ESPN have to okay this. And it makes you wonder, was this greenlit by some executive in the UFC? Because it would have taken more than one person, Jay. That's like, see, there you go.
No, follow the stitchery.
See, exactly. You gotta go edgy bra on this. You gotta look into it. But are we? This is the kind of thing that actually has fallout. Kareem Zidane did a small investigation that came out today because this, that's not a good group to get national recognition. This is on ESPN. ESPN, the big one. I mean, a million change people watch this, and we're like, hey, what is that? What you see is what you get, or whatever that letters he has on his thing say. And what's the big Q for? So, I wouldn't say it was trending, but that it's a stupid group of just whatever that don't need to be getting any more spotlight than they are. This shouldn't be talking about them because it's so dumb. But are we going to get like a, well, actually, House wasn't really my friend kind of thing? What's going to happen here? Because
if anything, we will probably get the opposite.
I mean,
Pat Milicic retweet.
I mean, what? I don't know what can come from this, but it didn't. It just felt bad. It didn't feel like the good kind of thing to see on a broadcast, because I recognized something like, what is that? Because I didn't know what it was, but then finding out, oh, really? So that was okay. That we're okay with that. So yeah, I'm not surprised that we're all okay with that.
Yeah, interesting timing too, considering that just days before this event, there was one of their flags was flown over the Jackson Winklejohn MMA Academy. So, gotta love the sport. All right, gentlemen. I'm not surprised. Mr. Falcon's moment comes courtesy of one Josh Emmett, who was able to win in a banger against Shane Burgos. But the part about this is that he did this while suffering a completely destroyed left knee. So very early into the opening frame, he theorized that he extended too far on a kick. I mean, on a punch, got kicked in the leg at the same time, hyperextended his knee, and allow me to read the injury list from the world famous SureDog.com here on the news article that was written by, let's see, was this written by who I think it was written by? Oh, it was written by Tristan.
It wasn't me.
All right. But anyway, well, Tristan's a nice guy. But anyway, move on from that. He said, according to ESPN, the injuries were as follows. A partial tear of his MCL, a Baker's cyst rupture, which is essentially fluid leaking into the calf, a focal impact fracture of the femur, cartilage damage, and severe swelling. And
a complete tear of his ACL.
Yes, and a complete ACL tear. Good Lord. Like, just hearing about those injuries makes me want to cry and cower. As gyms are reopening across California, I've been thinking, man, I want to get back into training. I haven't been training since I moved into my house, and I was looking up some gyms, and then thinking about these injuries, like, maybe I'll just stay home and keep getting fat. So that's my I'm not surprised, Mr. Falcon's moment. All right, fellas. So now we'll move on here to an interesting hashtag that has popped up since we were last on air, and that is hashtag Joe Silva stories. Now fighters are speaking out about their pay and especially about Joe Silva's role as far as negotiations go, as he was the longtime matchmaker for the promotion, who was severed ties with the company after the Endeavor purchase. But fellas, now, what do you think about the fighters finally now speaking out about fighter pay and Joe Silva as sort of the UFC's hitman at the negotiating table?
Well, it's in a lot of cases former UFC fighters speaking about the former UFC matchmaker. So beyond the titillation value in reading these horror stories, like, oh my god, what an asshole, what a bastard, it won't I don't think it will affect much. Like, I didn't need to see the tweets to be able to guess that Gray Maynard probably wasn't very happy with how he had been treated by the UFC during his tenure. Like, and it's not just him. You could say the same about fighter X that used to fight for the UFC, but because he was one of the very best fighters not to win a title in its toughest division for several years and was a guy, you know, who didn't have a whole lot of pizzazz or marketability, I would have been dead certain that that dude retired like unhappy with how he'd been treated by the UFC. So, and you could always kind of see that between the lines. But I mean, a lot of people didn't know who Joe Silva was. I mean, how many times do you know somebody who's that little guy in the suit that just went and like shook the winner's hand? That's Joe Silva. The company, he played a vital role because, yeah, he was the matchmaker, but he was the matchmaker, the talent scout, the de facto negotiator. He was just the absolute bastard hatchet man in a way that nobody else wanted to be or could be. Even Dana White, who likes to posture as tough, like, do you want to be a fucking fighter? Like that guy will never fight in the UFC again. This guy will never fight in the UFC again. There's a lot of bluster there. He still wants to be the good dude who gets to hang around fighters and the fighters like him and have to show him respect, like the Godfather. He couldn't do the Joe Silva role. Like, the UFC needed a Joe Silva. If you enjoy the modern product, the stories that you're reading right now are what helped to get you there. It took somebody just getting the best possible fighters at the lowest possible pay and making them as pliable as possible for the matchups that the UFC wanted to make, where and when they wanted to make them. Like, it's ugly, but it's maybe worse, but not fundamentally different than what you'd see in a lot of other sports built on individual matchmaking.
What I find kind of funny about this, like, Joe Silva always tried to fly under the radar. He very rarely gave interviews. He very rarely. I can think back to a bunch of conversations I've had with like TJ DeSantis and Jordan Breen about their efforts to try to get Joe Silva to come on Sherdog Radio and tell some stories, because obviously he's a wealth of MMA knowledge and all sorts of behind the scenes information. But no luck on that. There was one time way back when I was coaching a friend of mine through his first amateur tournament. We went to the WKAs in Richmond, Virginia, and Joe Silva, hailing from that area, he was there. He definitely was still with the UFC at this time. This was probably 2012, I believe, somewhere around there. Yeah. He was there hanging out, and he was so low profile. Essentially, nobody at a martial arts tournament, at a mixed martial arts tournament, knew who he was. He was sitting around. He came in by himself. He's all of 5'4", dressed in like a jeans and a hoodie, and just walking around completely casually. And he was so taken back that we recognized who he was and like got a picture with him. Like, nobody, that's just how the dude rolls. Like, he's just very low key guy. So imagine the level of cringe that popped up when he heard that his name is in headlines years after he's no longer a part of the UFC. But Jay, I know I know you definitely have something to say on this. So I'll throw this question at you on top of whatever you have to say. Do you think that any of these stories coming out now and the complaints about fighter pay, do you think they're going to change anything in the long run?
They won't, because of exactly how he introduced it. Because the problem is twofold. First of all, Joe Silva's not with the UFC anymore. When the buyout happened, when WME purchased Joe Silva, going to buy out, and he was out. He was good. He did what he wanted to do, and he was out. And second of all, these fighters are not in the UFC anymore. They're not UFC fighters. Ray Maynard released. John Fitch released. Name. You can see them are not on the roster. And they're able to say these things without fear of reprisal, because it's a notorious thing that the UFC would punish fighters for speaking out against them, for doing things they didn't want them to do, for getting their names in the headlines. I'm sure that we all remember this one. Ali Quinta had a rampage and broke his hotel many moons ago. And because of that, the UFC banned him because of the bad publicity that came out, and because he was being an idiot, banned him from winning post-fight bonuses for a set amount of fights. Just you can't win them. And that was a very stressful time for him. And there were performances where he deserved them, but can't get them. It won't change because the people that need to speak out are the people that are dealing with these things now. I mean, not just from a legal perspective, because legally speaking, when I've seen some of these stories, they've made me want to tear out what little hair I have left, because there's just not some of these provisions and some of these contract and renegotiations and the almost borderline coercion, to use that dirty word, is striking. Like Hector Lombard had the story it was his story, but where Hector Lombard, when he was brought over from Bellator, the UFC paid him a king's ransom. They paid him a ton of hundreds, six-figure contract per fight. It was a real deal contract. And he had a string of losses, and the UFC said, okay, we can cut you, or you can take a cut in pay, and we'll let you keep fighting. No. You signed a contract that you have to pay him that much money. If he's going to be on the roster, then you can't say, we're not going to honor the contract, we're going to cut you, or you take less money. That's not a negotiation tactic. That's borderline felonious. So, but at the same time, from a legal perspective, the statute of limitations of these contracts have passed. These claims are old. These fighters can't even sue the UFC for these claims 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 years ago. So it is so water under the bridge almost that if these fighters had legitimate grievances and wanted to air them, other than to be included in the discussion that Masvidal and Jones and even Conor to an extent, Cejudo are having about we want more pay, that's the way they can get involved in the situation. Because what's the point in finding out what Josh Thompson thought about his pay contract when he got signed after Strikeforce and went over to Bellator? That was a long time ago, and there's nothing the UFC can do to stop him, but there's nothing he can do about it. So it just feels like shouting out to the void now. And it's going to gain some traction. It's going to gain some laughs. It's going to have a few sleepless nights for Joe Silva. But he doesn't care. Joe Silva is just, he's got Scrooge McDuck money. You know, he doesn't need to worry about any of this nonsense. He probably doesn't even, he's probably not even on Twitter anymore. I don't even know if he was ever on to begin with.
Yeah, I don't think he ever was on.
So other than somebody texting him like, hey, man, just to let you know, some of these things that you said, we got those emails. We're going to put them out. And he'll be like, ah, crap. Oh, well, I guess I'll enjoy my Saturday because I don't care. This is one instance. This is about the only time I can say it and not feel like a crazy person. This is the one time where people should be on the side of John Jones and not Daniel Cormier. Because if you want to have to speak out about your issues, you want to be the one to be vocal about it and not be a company man and shut up and get whatever money you're going to get. So to answer your question, this won't change anything. It'll make a couple people have some sleepless nights. It'll make Lawrence Kasdan, I believe, or whoever, whatever his name is, the attorney, kind of go, oh God, this is annoying. It's akin to a Twitter spat. It's just, oh, my dirty laundry's out, and then everyone forgets because someone's going to test positive for COVID or this or that. So it's a blip on the radar, sadly.
You know what? I don't think that this necessarily is that big of a deal. I agree with you guys that you know, if it's ex-fighters, well, I should say fighters that formerly were with the UFC, or, you know, and the statute of limitations from a contractual standpoint is passed and all that. Yeah, that doesn't really have much effect on things, and Joe Silva's long gone from the promotion. But I think in totality, it's another one of those cogs in the wheel that's turning. When you have, I mean, we were just talking about Curtis Blades getting trashed on the podium by Dana White. We neglected to mention the fact that he's been vocal about fighter pay. You know, there are so many fighters that are currently on the roster that are discussing pay, and Jones and Masvidal and Cejudo retiring as a result. There's so many things that are happening that this just kind of adds on to it. So in totality, this is just a piece of the puzzle, but I don't think it's the most pivotal piece of that puzzle.
I just like to correct myself real quick because I don't know why I thought of director Lawrence Kasdan when I meant to say Hunter Campbell, but the name wouldn't come to me. Hunter Campbell is who I'm talking about. So work with me here. It's been.
I was wondering who the hell that was. I was like, well, I guess he knows about.
I knew it wasn't when I said it, but I couldn't. It just wasn't coming back together. I don't know if I was thinking of Kirk Hendrick or something, but it was just the name I couldn't think of. Anyway, yeah.
Sorry. Sometimes the facts and figures get jumbled. It's all good, bro.
Too many.
All right, fellas. So let's move on from this now. Of course, in this day and age, we can't discuss anything without discussing COVID-19 and the effect that it's having on the world around us. That same world that happens to host the sport known as mixed martial arts. So, with that being said, we're seeing some states hitting backwards as far as flattening that curve is concerned. My state that I'm in right now, California, seems to be one of them. Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Texas, where you are, Ben. A lot of places across the U.S. are experiencing renewed spikes in the novel coronavirus. So, are we headed toward another shutdown of the sport in this country, gentlemen?
Take the floor, Duffy.
First, put some respect on the name of my state. Texas is spearheading this second wave of coronavirus.
Damn it, I was drinking.
Like, it's bad enough that Texas isn't as big as Alaska, but you're going to try to tell me that, like, you're going to say California and Arizona before you say our name. I mean, last week when the cases started to spike again, we were getting around 23,000 new cases a day nationwide, over 4,000 of which were in Texas. You guys know what my actual personal familial situation is, and they are completely stressed out. You know, my wife is like, we're, getting calls from paramedics asking if we have bedroom, beds in our ICU and our IMU. We don't, we're diverting where we can. This is the problem with COVID-19. Even if the native mortality rate of it seems low on paper, it doesn't take much to completely overwhelm the ICU capacity of a major city. I mean, Houston, depending on where you draw the lines, is the third, fourth, or fifth largest city in America. Its ICUs are sitting over 90% full, which is about as full as you can get. Kind of the same way the unemployment rate never goes below about 3 or 4%, no matter how good things are, just because of natural, turnover. Your ICU can't get much fuller than 90% because of just, people dying or getting better and being transferred to a different floor. So they're just completely racked up. She's in a major hospital and they're just bracing for it. It's bad. It's worse than the first time around. It's a nightmare. Having said that, and this is going to sound like a really weird pivot, I don't know if it's going to affect the UFC's. Unless Nevada itself gets crushed, I think the UFC will steam ahead. They've got things in place. And to the UFC's credit, what I'm hearing now from people who are present at these events, even off the record where they'd have no reason to, to hide anything, they're saying that, the precautions are outstanding now. And I mean, we got some of that on air from our friend Rodney James Edgar. So as long as there's some place in the country or in the world that they can bring in fighters relatively safely, and they've got the apex kind of locked down like they do, I think the UFC is going to steam right ahead. They just might not be picking Fury Fighting Championships bones clean for the next couple months.
They already did, though. Man, here we go again. Come on. Let me be the ray of sunshine for once. I mean, things are statistically worse than they've ever been in the world, not just in the U.S., but in the world. I mean, on Sunday, there were 183,000 new cases in the world alone, which is the most we've ever had. And Brazil is the number 2 country, and it's rapidly catching up. So that will hurt the UFC as well as the domestic infection rate, period. Personally, I'm surprised that some smaller organizations that are not quite the majors, like the LFA. LFA is coming back in July, posting up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So very isolated from hopefully everything that goes on, but they still have to fly fighters in. But just boom, 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 week after week. But man, the thing that I said at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, when we're starting to shut down and back off from business as usual, is that beyond the UFC and the Bellators, and maybe even the companies that can afford a studio like a Combat Americas or something, the regional promotions are just absolutely getting ravaged. The Fury Fighting Championships, the Island Fights, in Florida, and on for states that operate MMA promotions that pretty much exclusive in that state, that cannot operate without gate revenue, meaning fans in the stands. That's how these organizations make their money, is by live attendance, because there's no pay-per-view going on to speak of. Some may have a $5 fight deal, but that's it. So the money exists from fans being in the building. So without regional MMA, that is a trickle-up effect. That is the kind of it's turning off the pipeline. Which is what my concern is that, like the Contender Series, which we have a segment on it, but we can kind of push through because we know the news. The Contender Series that's going to be in August, the UFC, or well, technically Dana White, is planning on having a 10-week stretch in August, September, and October. But how are they going to staff the roster from these regional fighters that either have not fought in a year or are live in states that have issues, high infection rate, or lockdowns, or whatever they may be? I think this will indirectly, at the very least, indirectly affect the UFC, because of the ability to get non-roster fighters, to get the Anthony Ivies and Christian Aguileras and the Max Roskovs of the world not able to fill out the cards, I think is where it will hurt. So I would not be surprised if week in, week out, we may have 10 fight cards, 8 fight cards, 7 fight cards, just because the concern of flying people into Vegas or wherever they are is just going to be a daunting task. So buckle up, sports fans. We're not out of the woods yet.
Yeah, I mean, this is we're definitely, we thought we were in unprecedented territory before. I think we're headed firmly back in that direction, quickly hitting uncharted waters here. Now, as long as the governments of the relative state governments, wherever, are allowing businesses to open and to function, there will be fights. I think, and the UFC, I don't even want to talk about them necessarily in this discussion, because Fight Island exists to skirt regulation. So they are already, they've already set a plan in motion to be completely isolated from the rest of the regulatory world in the United States. So they've got that set in place. But for your LFAs and Bellators and even Bellator could have the capacity to do this if they wanted to with Viacom backing. But you guys get my point. They already, these regional promotions, they are going to be hurting for money, just like every other business, just like Sally's beauty salon down the street that's opening up regardless of what's going on in the rest of the world. And I think we all know of at least 1 or 2 businesses that were operating as if nothing happened throughout the entire pandemic illegally. I think we all know of something that was doing that because they simply needed the money. That is going to happen across all combat sports as well. So unless the regulators shut it down, unless like you said, Nevada, New Jersey, or in any major commission shuts it down, it's going to be shut down. But we did have Tachi Palace as a thing. So there is Native American territory. There is there's states that don't have proper athletic commissions. So something's going to happen.
Wyoming.
Now the quality of those fights might be super trash. I mean, we might be headed back to the era of a Monty Cox show in the barn, where like if you didn't have too much beer in the stands, you might get in the main event. Like, so
Hey,
we might have that.
Clay Guida just had a pretty good night, you know.
Yeah.
Taking it back.
I mean, I've said it before. I'll say it again. This is a best chance as any to call out CM Punk. So I might as well go ahead get my shot.
Shoot your shot, man.
Yeah, go ahead get my combo on or something. I don't know. I guess I got to start training again. Damn. But anyway,
and CM Punk, nah, not really.
No, me out of shape. Me, no, I'm not taking my shirt off on TV if I'm out of shape. It's just not happening, bro.
Okay, Rampage.
Now, they pay me like Rampage, I would be up here like a glutton. And I will take that fall too. So let's go ahead and move on before I volunteer to be the next Bob Sapp. We of course have to discuss a little bit here from our good friends One Championship.
One Championship? They didn't do something stupid, did they?
No, of course not. Of course not. So, I mean, this is a bit older news, but as the tradition goes, one does something stupid, we say something about it. Now, they made news because they announced that they were picking up an additional $70 million in investment capital. This included old investors and a few new ones, according to the statement here. They were thrilled to make this announcement. And, of course, at the end of it, they also announced that they were cutting 20% of their staff. Josh Gross, formerly of The Athletic, reported very soon afterward that the cuts actually, according to his sources, were more around 50 to 60% of One Championship's entire staff. Gentlemen, what do we make of this mixed bag of nuts that Chartry dropped in our laps last week?
I mean, I received this email last week, 11 p.m. my time. 11 p.m. I'm off duty. I'm not writing on news articles or doing any silly, funny business then. And drop that nugget. I mean, the whole thing was 2 paragraphs long. I don't know if you've seen the entirety of it, and most people have. The title said One Championship adds $70 million to its war chest. Okay, and then they went on to the PR statement went on to say that they added $70 million, bringing the total capital to almost 350, streamlining operations, and a 20% reduction in total worldwide headcount. They are thrilled to announce this. So, gained $70 million, up to 350, and cutting staff by a massive amount. Corporations have the right to hire and fire whomever they wish, especially in other countries that don't have as stern business policies. They can even do it coldly, no remorse, without much notice. Just this is what has to happen. We have to do the cuts. The Athletic, as we just mentioned, the Athletic. Sorry, guys, but what are we going to do here? But for the person, and this is just a little nuanced thing that just got to me, that the person was thrilled to announce this information. I mean, there's tone deaf, and then there's that. And then I think it was a site I'd never heard of called Tech in Asia, released a letter that Chatri said to the staff saying that there would be sort of a severance package. And what I recall is that they would be able to keep some benefits until a certain period of time. Some of them would get a certain severance package, salary per month of salary or something. And the people in what are the other ones? People in Singapore that work in Singapore could keep their gym membership for the rest of the year, and they could all keep their laptops. So what an awesome deal! Now, yeah, the cuts are 50 to 60% from what we've been hearing and what has been spread around pretty massively. Is that every freelancer that had worked for one, gone. So I'll give you a personal example. It's not a private information. This is something that is publicly known, and you can find this on websites, whatever. I used to have 3 PR contacts to talk to One Championship about news and information. I have 1 now, so that's kind of a line for how things have been going. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong lens. Maybe I have the whole gloom and doom thing going a little too hard because the coronavirus is running rampant. We just talked about it. The coronavirus is just rampaging through events with no live events going on for One Championship. How can they stay in business? But then I look at One Championship saying that they somehow wrangled an additional $70 million in an investment. So investors looked at One Championship, presumably saw enough financials, this is publicly released information in 2017, 2018, and before, that One Championship has been hemorrhaging money. $120 million lost the last, and this is disclosed by One Championship on their own financial documents. So there's no lost in translation bit to it. Do the investors suffer from what we in the economics world call the sunk cost fallacy, which means they looked at what they put in and said, okay, we've thrown in $20 million already. Well, let's relook at this situation. One's still around. We've already put in $20 million. So if we pull out now, we'll lose everything we have. So I guess we're going to have to put in some more money, because logically, who would look at the business model and the revenue stream and all the numbers and say, I'm going to throw $70 million at this company? I just, it doesn't make sense. And please, somebody make sense of it. Try.
I just wanted to point out how when Bloody Elbow, I think John Nash was the one who put out the most recent article about their losses around the $126 million mark, something around there. And their defense for this was to attack the credibility of the report that was based on One Championship's own public filings.
Yeah,
it's just muteness. A chef's kiss for comedy. So just from my perspective on this, every so often, although I grossly need to update my profile on this, but LinkedIn, I'll go and see what jobs are available in whatever fields I'm qualified to be hired in. And I'd started seeing some months back a lot of listings for One Championship, as they were supposed to be opening locations in Los Angeles and New York. And I'm seeing so many listings for Los Angeles, like needing social media managers and all sorts of random positions and whatnot. Now, over time, and I'll say very recently, though, those listings just started disappearing. And less and less jobs for One Championship were being posted to job sites. So I kind of figured something was going on. I assumed it was all COVID-19 related, that their plans to expand were going to be stalled by the virus, and they definitely have said that they were delaying their debut in the United States and whatnot. So kind of figured it was that. Didn't realize it went deeper than that. The only question I have, gentlemen, are we still going to get that reboot of The Apprentice? Ben, what were your initial thoughts on some of this?
Okay, well, having been already the guy that stood up for Robert Drysdale, let me now be the person who stands up for One Championship. And again, this is not going to be a full-throated defense where I get up on my little podium and bang the table for One Championship. But look at it this way. If they said, they cut 20% of their workforce, and other people are saying, oh, it's more like 40 or 50. If they cut all of their freelancers first, so they're cutting the people first who, wrote 10 tweets a week for peanuts. And, that's the large proportion of what they lost. And they only lost a few of their actual core people that more or less worked full time for the promotion. The real truth in what the change in their workforce looks like probably falls somewhere in the middle. They tried to minimize it. Obviously, especially Bloody Elbow is going to jump on the least flattering possible numbers. But the truth might be somewhere in the middle there. Also, more than any other promotion, they have been hit by COVID. They are based in Singapore, and their normal itinerary of fights just bounces them around the countries that were first and hardest hit. Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, countries that in some cases we don't even have reliable numbers for how they're doing with COVID. So one was hit first, hit hardest. So for them to have to borrow more money to stay afloat and reduce their workforce, just lay some people off, is what you would expect. It would almost be irresponsible if they continued to just hemorrhage huge amounts of money without changing anything. So I mean, they're doing what they need to do. My response, and really the only thing I have to say about it, I find myself echoing the words of Dana White, who retweeted that tweet with the simple thing, why the fuck would you tell people this?
Yeah, fair point there. I think it's more so like we totally would understand if like they have to take people off and this there are cuts. I mean, we're in sports media. We have been directly affected by these cuts. We've seen our friends, get laid off. We're watching this happen all around us, and just kind of waiting for the axe to drop on our heads in a lot of ways. So that we get, it's the tone deafness, or even the level of tone deaf is just astronomical.
Yeah.
To say, hey, this is great. We got all this money. By the way, we not paying you anything. You're laid off. It does. Those two things just don't align. So,
yeah, right.
I mean, chartry gonna chartry. So, all right, fellas, let's move on to the speed bag, and we will wrap things up for the day. So, fortunately, I got lucky here because I did get a new phone. My Round Timer app didn't download, but I downloaded it just while we were talking there. And somehow or another, all my settings are just there. So, all I've got to do is select the ones that are applicable here. So, gentlemen, you will each have 10 seconds to answer the following questions here. Now, actually, no, it's only three of us today, so we're each getting 10 seconds. So this clock is going to keep ticking here, gentlemen. I'm going to start with you first, Jay. You'll get to start us off with, where would you place Josh Emmett versus Shane Burgos on your fight of the year list for 2020? You have 10 seconds.
Man, it's a clear number 2 between Filey Zhang and Joanna Jędrzejczyk, and that's really too bad for them because no one's going to top that one this year.
Duffy.
I'd put it somewhere in the top 5, but I think you've got to have Luque versus Price, Gaethje versus Ferguson, Hooker versus Felder in there somewhere as well. Probably 3rd or 4th when I think about it.
Yeah, I'm probably gonna go 5th off the top of my head, but I mean JJ versus Whaley is number 1. There's nothing beating that. All right, cool. Oh, sweet.
Oh, hey.
That got a little fancy there. All right, so gentlemen, now second question. I will start with you on this one, Ben. The UFC officially announced over 45 bouts across 4 Fight Island cards in July. Pick one single fight out of those that you find the most interesting. You have 10 seconds, Ben.
Jessica Andrade versus Rose Namajunas.
Good one.
Okay. All right. So we got time to spare. And Jay.
You know, if we want to dig a little past main events and Shogun versus Little Nog 3, obviously the fight of the year there, I'm going to go with Irish Joe Duffy coming back against Joel Alvarez, who's 16-2 with 16 finishes.
All right. I'm going to go with Jack Hermanson versus Kelvin Gastelum. That's just an interesting fight. I'd like to see where both of those gentlemen stand in the division. Sorry, we didn't have much comedy on this segment, but it came out really smooth because my app.
The comedy was Jay saying that Little Nog versus Shogun 3 was going to be fight of the year 15 years after their second their last one was fight of the year in 2005.
All right, fellas. So let's see. I think that actually we got one last question here. Now, I will, I guess, start this one off. Dana White has expressed reservations for Anderson Silva's last 2 bouts on his contract. How would you match Silva to send him out? I say give him a Rockhold or a 3rd Weidman fight. I think those make a lot of sense as far as where they are in their career trajectories. Duffy.
I can't beat that. Give me Rockhold or Weidman.
And Jay.
I mean, let's be real. Silva has won 1 fight since 2013. So why not somebody like Shogun Hua? Let's get weird.
I wonder, will they actually fight each other?
I think they would, yeah.
They haven't trained together in a long time. No. I think they would, yeah.
Oh, interesting. All right, cool. All right, fellas. So very quickly here, we've got the next offering from the UFC is this weekend. Dustin Poirier and Dan Hooker are in the main event. But other than the main event, what fight stands out to you the most?
You know, I feel this is a fight that, I mean, it was just announced just the other day. Jin Yu Fry and Kay Hansen, which is an Invicta fight being pulled to the UFC because both women are signed to the Invicta roster. Jinh Fry, the former atomweight champion, 105 pounds, and Kay Hansen, a 20-year-old 115-pounder, thrust into the UFC. So I kind of feel for Invicta there because it's kind of picking the bones of a very small roster that has fighters with more than like 3 fights on there. My thoughts more about that fight are that it's going to be an interesting matchup to see if Jinh Fry, how she translates to 115 pounds. But my thoughts more gravitate towards why doesn't the UFC buy out Invicta, run them like they ran the WEC or Strikeforce, run independently, and allow for a little bit of transfer to go on, like borrowing Ed Herman to fight Jacare Souza, that kind of thing, to go back and forth to make it easier than straight pilfering the woman who should be champion. And the one fight that is not sticking out to me is Mickey Gall versus Mike Perry. I don't want it. Good. I'm good.
Yeah, I've been shouting about Invicta being co-promoted with the UFC forever.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't this happening already? Why hasn't this happened before? It's ridiculous. Mickey Gall, Mike Perry is like the worst co-main event since the day before forever.
Dude, not a good co-main event.
I mean, that's if Mike Perry can keep himself from punching brick walls before fight time and keep himself remotely healthy. I mean, good gracious, he's going to have a ridiculous corner situation. But anyway, what's one fight that stands out to you on this one?
I really like the co-main event, Mike Perry versus Mickey Gall. It's two guys. It's 2 guys with some very kind of impressive, sensational wins in the UFC, but who've fallen off recently. And really, for a main event, it's 2 guys that are kind of behind the 8 ball to prove that they belong in the promotion going forward. On top of that, Perry has, he's made some change up in his fight camp, in his training regimen. He is going to be going out with nothing but his girlfriend as his corner. And so I kind of expect that we'll see a different Mike Perry, probably one with a new and more developed skill set. And I wouldn't be surprised if he just comes out with a completely retooled game and takes Gall apart, and Mike Perry's girlfriend is Gym of the Year for 2020.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Perry by flying omoplata. Yeah, it sounds totally logical. I will say this: she will be a better cornerman than Josh Fabia. So we do know that.
Yes.
Hey, this is actually a legit question, though.
Yeah.
This girlfriend, is this the same girlfriend that competed at SUG not long ago, or is this the ex-girlfriend?
I think it's the one at SUG. So she's more qualified than Fabia.
The other one.
Yeah, but she's definitely more qualified than Josh Fabia ever was. So that I do know she's like actually.
I'm more qualified than Josh Fabia.
He has got more actual MMA coaching experience. I've coached more MMA fights than Josh Fabia. So,
CM Punk, where you at?
Come get this work. So I'll just go ahead and point out one fight that I'm intrigued by: Luis Pena and Kamal Worthy. Sign me up. That sounds like an action fight right there that actually has implications for the future of the lightweight division. So looking forward to that one. So that is going to do it for this edition of Unleashed. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Ben, for joining me once again. And you can find us on our Twitter handles that are down here below in the magic of post-production. So you can find their work on Sherdog.com. You can find my work on The Body Lock. You can also find me on MMA On Point and my MMA News. So you know what you got to do. Stay beautiful, stay positive, stay sexy. Keep those nursery rhymes in the background to keep your son happy while you're recording. And always stay sexy. I'll see you when I see you. Peace.